Marginalized Populations, Part 3, Women and Children Exposed to Violence. This is the third part of a three-part webinar series hosted by Community-Based Research Canada. My name is Jana Martin, and I am the CBRC Secretariat Support Person. I will be the moderator for today's session. Community-Based Research Canada's mission is to address the real societal problems through research as a national champion and facilitator for community-based research and campus community engagement in Canada. For 10 years, CBRC has brought together key players of community campus partnerships. Some CBRC founding members continue to be on the CBRC board today. Our network builds capacity for academia and broader communities to collaborate and use research as a tool to mobilize community participation and action. We would love to hear from you. Please share your comments and questions in the chat box during or after the presentation. I will share your questions with the presenter during the Q&A period, which will take place for 15 minutes at the end of this webinar. I am pleased to present today's presenter, Dr. Mavis Morton. Dr. Morton has 25 years of experience in community-based research. She also has extensive experience integrating CEL opportunities into junior and senior undergraduate courses, for which she was awarded the UGFA Distinguished Professor Award for Innovation in Teaching in 2014. Mavis is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph. Her areas of interest and focus include violence against women, women in the law, feminist criminology, justice and social policy, public sociology, community-based participatory research, and community-engaged learning. Thank you for joining us today, and I will now hand it over to David.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you to Community-Based Research Canada for the opportunity to talk about this important work. So I will just start by saying that my plan for our time together, and thank you for whoever is out there joining us today. My plan is to really talk not very much about the substantive issue of violence against women and gender-based violence, but instead talk about the things that I have learned with many community partners and those most impacted by this issue, students that I work with, about how to do research in areas against women and children. So that's what I will mainly talk about. So I'll say a couple of initial comments about the issue and then get to talk specifically about many different research methodologies that are commonly used to address this issue. But then I want to spend the most of my time talking about the way that I frame the work that I do with community partners and students, and that's to talk about critical community engagement. So I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about what I think are really important foundational principles, practices that come out of those principles in doing.
Sorry to interrupt. Someone's actually having a difficult time hearing you. Are you able to speak a little bit more into your microphone?
Sure. I'll move up a bit. I didn't want to yell, but is that a little better if I do that?
She's typing. Let's see what she says.
Okay. I can certainly speak up.
Yep, it sounds like it's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christy, for letting us know. Just let me know if that happens again. After talking about the concept of critical community engaged scholarship, I will talk about some of the principles and the practices that guide the work. And then I will provide some examples of previous and current research on this issue that I'm engaged with or have been engaged with. I'll identify some of what are common challenges and then end with a few sort of just reminders of things that I think are important paths to be on for principled practices. Okay, so moving on. As I mentioned, this issue of violence against women and their children, I tend to use that language to talk about this. It's also talked about commonly as gender-based violence. And today we're talking about this issue and in particular, marginalization and marginal identities that are most impacted by gendered violence. So we can understand gender-based violence as rooted in structural gender inequalities, patriarchal belief systems, and power imbalances. And these result from interlocking forms of oppression and systems of power that marginalize, that coerce, that pathologize, and exploit people who hold less power. This inequality that is based on numerous and multiple identities that come from structural barriers and inequality, including race and ethnicity, class, sex, sexual orientation, ability, etc. Those inequalities are exacerbated and heightened for those at the margins. And it's why this focus is so important. And this, of course, increases their vulnerabilities for experiencing violence. And it also reduces or even eliminates their access to necessary resources and supports. So within marginalized communities, the way that I understand this issue, violence against women and their children, or gender-based violence, or intimate partner violence in particular, is embedded in a structural context in which individualized patterns of violence are mediated by legacies of structural oppression, discriminatory policies, and the lack of access to resources. And I'll just note, I have a number of references at the end, but in particular, one of my colleagues, Myrna Dawson, her and her colleagues just came out with a report from the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative that's called One is Too Many, Trends and Patterns in Domestic Homicides in Canada, 2010 to 2015, and it specifically looks at vulnerable populations. So that's a new resource that you might be interested in. So as I mentioned, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about what we know about this issue, but I will say that we now, I've titled this Gains and Gaps, and really the 2 points that I want to make is that despite 40 years of research about violence against women and their children, we do know a lot because of that. And one of the things that we also know is that the research on marginalized groups is generally underrepresented in research studies. And yet, as I mentioned previously, those groups are often more vulnerable populations that are at greater risk of violence against women. And that, again, is a result of a number of things. So we know a lot about this issue, but we also know that the gaps are that we don't have enough information and research, particularly with respect to individuals at this intersection. And what's important is to also understand that this means individuals who are often have multiple identities, and it is that intersectional understanding that is so important to this work. And then the other thing, and I would argue that that intersectional analysis is what can help provide that more of that information that we really don't have. And that intersectional lens can be used to both do research but understand the roots of violence, the barriers and the resiliences to the issue and to seeking help from some of the violence and social responses resources that are available. So the other thing that I think is a gap is that we also in some cases have used more sort of traditional research approaches that have done us a disservice and in fact can reify some of the same patterns of power and control that we're actually trying to understand about this issue of violence against women and their children. Sorry, I just realized that I forgot to share that slide with you. So now I'm going to move on to talk about how we can then address some of those gaps in knowledge and also think about how community-based research methodologies can help us attend to those gaps. So in this slide, I've just listed a number of what you will likely be very familiar with, a number of research methodologies and methods that are common to community-based research. And I want to highlight two of them. One of them I'm going to spend a lot more time on, and that is talking about community-engaged research within a community-engaged scholarship framework. But I also want to point to the last methodology on this list, which is referred to as transformative community-based participatory research. So I just want to acknowledge that that this is regarded as a subset of community-based participatory research that focuses specifically on issues of power and liberation, and that the aim is to create social change and challenge systems of oppression. It centers the voices of those who are most impacted by the social issues being examined and engage them throughout the research process. So what I think is important about this, and again, you'll see the similarities to the critical community engaged scholarship that I'm going to talk about in a minute, that this kind of methodology is rooted in an understanding that certain groups experience a history of marginalization, disenfranchisement, subordination, and other types of oppression. And I think that that's really important kind of research foundation to have in doing this work. So now I'm going to move on to what I will spend more time talking about and where I would place my work, which is community engaged research, which is, as I mentioned, I would put within a larger frame of community engaged scholarship, and I will look at that definition next. So community engaged research, I like this definition, talks about a collaborative approach to research that democratically involves community participants and researchers in one or more phases of the research process. Partners share responsibility, leverage their unique strengths to enhance understanding of the target of research and integrate the derived knowledge with action to improve the well-being of community members. So that sits within the larger language, I would say, of community engaged scholarship, which is more generally a collaboration between institutions of higher education and their larger communities for the mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. And then the last definition that I want to provide is this this language of critical community engaged scholarship, and I see this as being conceptualized similar to the transformative community-based research, participatory research model that I talked about a few minutes ago. So De Cruz was the one that introduced me to this language of critical community engaged scholarship. And what I think is so important to that, important about that, is that the purpose is to address public issues by drawing attention to their structural causes, and that this collaborative research supports community university partnerships in producing knowledge that specifically focuses on dismantling systemic sources of racial and social injustice. So I think that's a really important intention, and I now tend to use the language of critical community engaged scholarship rather than the more general community engaged scholarship um, uh, language. The next slide is really a synopsis of a lot of research that's available that has looked at common principles and practices or processes of um, community engaged scholarship, and more specifically critical community engaged scholarship. So again, there's lots of research now on this, and so what a graduate student of mine, Rebecca Pereira, and I did in the summer was just try to make a sort of a simple visual that hold together many of the most common principles that underlie um, the doing of critical community engaged scholarship. So this is really, I think, the most essential part of my talk, and the most essential slide. Um, I think that what I have learned is that using and being guided by these principles is really important, and it's really what I use to think about how I do any of this work, and is constantly a source of conversation with community partners, community members, and students that we work together on these issues with. So I'll come back to these more specifically, and we'll give you some examples of what I and others mean, but I think these are really crucial as ways to guide what we do. The next slide is just an articulation of those sort of common steps or process pieces that fit with the principles. So again, I'm going to be talking specifically about these and in a bit more detail. So the first step, and I'm going to be talking about these steps and then interrelated principles, which I think are important principles that you see and should be reflecting on and using at all during all of the steps. So again, this sort of simplifies what actually is a very iterative and complex process or set of processes. So step one is really about the context, the community, and starting to develop, or in some cases, maintaining and sustaining the relationship. So it's about identifying and establishing who it is that you may be able to work with. And I think a really important point is how important it is to learn about the community that you're in, and that you plan to be working in and with. And I think the with is, of course, the most important language there. So just in terms of my experience, I have had the benefit of working with many individuals, organizations, advocates, activists on issues related to violence against women for now actually closer to 30 years. And many of those relationships are ongoing, and so we will connect with each other sometimes in very intentional ways. So, for example, I work with Ontario Women's Shelters, and they get together in a forum called Let's Talk twice a year, and I have been invited to attend those Let's Talk forums now for almost 10 years. And it is so many of those executive directors and other staff working in those organizations I've dealt with over many years, but it's a really good opportunity as a way to twice a year connect and listen to what some of the ongoing or new issues are that they're dealing with. I've also had a long time relationship with the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses. which is the acronym is OAIT. And again, I'll be speaking about a specific project that students and I are engaged in with them. And then more recently, I'm involved with an organization called Luke's Place, and the legal director there, Pam Cross. And we have known each other for a long time, but again, our relationship to work on a particular project is just over a year old now. So there's lots of ways to learn about and understand and listen to the people, the context, and develop those relationships. I'm just talking about some of the examples in terms of how I have experienced that. Step two is about starting to more specifically identify and plan what it is that you're going to be working on. And so I think what's most important here is really one of the principles of critical community engaged scholarship, which is identifying addressing a community identified need. And now I'm going to ask Janet to provide you with a little clip that we couldn't actually embed this, but this talks about one of the research projects that I did with the Guelph Wellington Sexual Assault Domestic Violence Action Committee, and together with many organizations, we did research to evaluate their sexual assault domestic violence protocol. So it was protocol evaluation research. So thanks, Jenna.
Of 3 graduate students, 2 community partners, and 1 faculty researcher. Our core community university research team consisted of 3 graduate students, 2 community partners, and 1 faculty. Our core community university research team consisted of 3 graduate students, 2 community partners, and 1 faculty researcher. Our multidisciplinary backgrounds included sociology, criminology, applied social psychology, social work, and public health. In addition to the core research team, our project involved the active engagement and collaboration of women who use sexual assault and domestic violence services, service providers, and members of the Guelph Wellington Action Committee for Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence.
Thanks. So again, that's just one example of the people involved in this particular project. So there are a number of important principles and practices here. So I talked about the community identified needs. So I want to just talk a little bit more about that. I think this is so crucial, and part of what's important to think about is ways to listen and develop practices and processes to be able to address and develop questions that are important to survivors of violence, in this case, in their communities. It also means choosing methods that are relevant and sensitive to their experiences. And it also means building research capacity to help ensure that the community can not only identify the needs, but also work on those issues, again, independently. So there's a number of issues there. And now I'm going to ask Jenna to play a clip of the executive director of the Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, who was the chair of the action committee that we worked with on this research. And she just talks here about the importance of working together from her experience as a community partner and working with university partners as well. Thanks, Jenna.
So we can be marginalized, and so when you blend those worlds of activism and academia, I think it gives credibility to the work that we're doing, and I think it gives the academics a better perspective of what's happening on the ground floor so that they don't sit in academia and just philosophize about stuff, but they're actually being able to say, I have a better insight into what's happening on a street level. So, and they're able to write with more authenticity about it. So I personally think it's a fabulous kind of it's a fabulous union when it's done, when universities and community agencies can mutually benefit each other. I think it's a really rich and powerful process. And you know, this organization has done several research projects with universities, both in town and other universities, where we've created some really good work. And so it's something that we continue to do. And I know that in the violence against women sector, uh, partnering with academic institutions is becoming now more the norm because everybody understands the value to both sectors. It's so, and I think that academics can have greater access to the work that we do and the people that we work with and for, whereas they might not be able to access them as easily just without partnering. So I think we need each other. I think we work well together, and I think when it benefits us mutually, it's a really, really worthwhile.
Thanks. So the next step that I want to talk about is really about communication, collaboration, and um, valuing, identifying and valuing community assets and strengths, which again historically has been something that has been severely lacking. And also, this step is about intentionally and actively sharing power and resources. I do have some further specific points with respect to communication and mutually beneficial relationships. But I'm going to ask Jenna to provide another little clip here, and then I'll. Thanks, Jenna.
We just got a comment from one of the participants about there being an echo that's problematic for the video.
Okay.
Either we can skip the video, or while I play the video, if you could mute your volume completely.
Okay. Sure, I'll do that.
Okay, so I'll play it then.
We learned a lot about how community and university partners can work together to design, complete, and report on research that a community wants done. The following highlights 5 things we learned as a result of our work together. 1. We tried to be clear about our different expectations and responsibilities. 2. Our CU partnership took time, skill, and patience. 3. The diversity of our partnership resulted in sharing different kinds of knowledge and skills. 4. Practicing shared decision-making increased the time and the quality of our work. And 5. We would work together again because we respect each other's diversity and skills, we trust each other, and we
Oops, sorry. Sorry. Sorry, I just have to. Something happened with my audio here. I just have to get rid of. Okay, so the next one, can you hear me okay, Jenna?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Okay, so in that little clip, one of the graduate students, Sarah, identified, some of the what was what was so beneficial in our community university collaboration. So I want to talk about a couple of going back to some of those principles. So one of them is about ensuring that the communication, first of all, is there. And I would say that such an important part of communication is actually about listening. And so part of that is about making sure that you're not speaking for or about a marginalized community, certainly without their full input, participation, and consent. And of course, what should be actively done is actually something that has been referred to by others as language justice, which is about, again, finding practices and processes to help ensure that services or in support language or appropriate interpretation or translation are available for those with limited English. Also, things like language justice refers to decentering English in favor of centering perspectives and experiences of limited or non-English speakers, which are among the most marginalized. But it also refers to ensuring, again, that you're actively prioritizing culturally relevant evidence that's grounded in the voices of community members. The next principle is about mutually beneficial relationships. So again, there's lots of ways to do that. These are some ideas that have come from mainly other people that I definitely saw as as important practices. So part of mutually beneficial relationships is about making co-agreements, co-created agreements. And I'll speak a bit later about work plans being a really good way to do that. It's about being transparent about each of the partners' needs and goals. And although sometimes that changes, it's important to have those conversations early and to be open to continue to talk about that in a transparent way. Um, it also means humility and ongoing self-reflection and critique, again, to ensure that you're not, even without meaning to, reinforcing and supporting processes that continue to oppress and make invisible the really important voices and experiences of those that you're working with to get co-create knowledge about violence against women. It means valuing the co-learning that can happen again, and that means having the right people involved to be able to benefit from all of the multiple experiences and ways of knowing. It means acknowledging the community's history with research harms. And let's face it, one of the things that I think we have a responsibility to do from the academic partner side is, there has been so much experience of going into communities for the purpose of research without any acknowledgement or understanding or involvement with the community members, and rather extracting data for the academics' benefit. We know that has happened. We know that we have a long history in that, and it's our responsibility to change that. And we now have lots of principles and practices to know how to do this differently. That's part of ensuring mutually beneficial relationships. And then, as I spoke about before, this idea of critical community engaged scholarship means intentionally and committing to actually do research in order to change structural conditions that perpetuate violence. And then the next principle is about meaningful collaboration. So I've talked about that a little bit, but again, it's recognizing and valuing that cultural intelligence. And another important point is what some refer to as boundary crossing. Again, it values the multi, inter, and transdisciplinary approach And you heard in one of the earlier clips about in the Guelph Wellington protocol research that we benefited by having so many people involved, coming from so many different disciplines and experiences. And that's a really common and important aspect of doing critical community engaged scholarship. And then speaking about collaboration, this next slide is really just an identification of some of the collaborative tools that I and my community partners and students often use as a way to help ensure that we are always um, having opportunities to communicate and collaborate. And so at this point in time, it may be that we don't actually physically get together as much as we would like to, and often that has to do with time and resources, but that there are now so many uh, um, tools that can be used for collaboration. So that slide just speaks to some of those, which we use all the time. The next slide is the next step, step 4, which is about the importance of using appropriate methodologies and methods. We've talked about the methodologies already, and also being flexible and responsive. So Sarah is going to talk a little bit about how important it was in her experience having the opportunity to hear from the women that were being interviewed in our protocol research about their experiences of using the services that were part of the protocol in Guelph Wellington, and how important it was to get feedback from the women that we were interviewing about the methods that we were using, and then being able to make changes and respond to their information and their feedback to help ensure that our methods were actually, appropriate and were going to help us get that important knowledge from the women who themselves had experienced violence. Jenna, do you mind playing that last clip, please?
Yep, for sure. Do you mind muting your volume again, and we'll not create the echo?
Of course.
The words that I've experienced working on this project has been with these service user interviews. So getting to meet a variety of women that you wouldn't maybe necessarily get to engage with has been particularly rewarding. They have so much experience and knowledge to share with us. And that has just been one piece that I've found really fantastic about this research project. And also their stories of abuse and violence are very sad sometimes and scary, but they also are so full of resilience and determination that you can't help but feel, some sense of encouragement from them. And I think it also speaks to the reciprocity of the research process. We asked the women at the end of the interview to provide some feedback about what the interview experience was like, and then we're able to incorporate that into the revisions of the interview guide. So, they're able to give us so much rich information about their experiences, and then hopefully we can then take some of their feedback and
And Jenna, if you could go back to the step 4 slide, please, which was 21. Thanks. So, oops, I'm going to just go back here to slide 21. Part of what I wanted to talk about here was, again, in addition to the previous research that Sarah was speaking about in that clip, this slide identifies 2 other current research projects that I'm working on. The one on the right side of the slide is with Pam Cross is there in the middle of the slide, She is the legal director with Luke's Place, and they're an organization that works with women who've experienced violence in intimate relationships and using family law systems. So she contacted me in the summer of 2017, and that organization works with court support workers and women who've experienced violence using family law, and they had identified that there was a real gap in research in looking at the experiences of women in using family law, but co-engaged with other legal systems. So the criminal law, child welfare system, immigration. So we're now working together with them to design a provincial court watch research project in family court throughout the province of Ontario. Luke's Place and myself with graduate students are working to start to develop both the methodologies and methods, which is what my graduate students and Pam and I were working on last fall and this fall. And Luke's Place is doing a lot of work starting to contact and develop relationships in communities across Ontario in order to ensure that we are, again, understanding those communities, understanding their issues as we start to design this new research project. And then the left side is work that I've been doing with the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses for a number of years now. And again, undergraduate students and graduate students at the University of Guelph that I have the opportunity to work with. We work with OAIF, Marlene Ham, who is the provincial coordinator, and shelters across the province of Ontario to identify women who've been killed as femicides in Ontario. We provide that information in a way that OAIF can use for educational and advocacy purposes. So part of that is about memorializing the women who have been murdered at the hands of often an intimate male partner. But we also do a critical media analysis of the way that mainstream news reports on femicide victims in Ontario. So we're just about to, this is the third media analysis that we've done with OAIF, and I've identified their website a little bit later. We're just about to put this newest 2017-2018 data on their website, and we refer to that as a heat map. Those are two projects that again are attempting to use appropriate methods, methodologies, be responsive, and collaboratively co-create knowledge. The next slide is about the last step that I'm going to talk about, which is about outcomes and the importance of balancing outcomes and products between community priorities and academic requirements. And one of the things that I wanted to just point to was a tool like the community-based research excellence tool that I know you've heard about previously on a webinar by Rich Jansen. But this kind of tool, I think, is an excellent resource as a way to help, think about, and you can use it at all stages, but I particularly find it useful as a way to think about and reflect on whether those principles and practices have actually been used, and whether we've actually been able to generate the kinds of outcomes and products that are going to be both community facing and provide what is required for academic purposes. The next slide is just an example of some of the outcomes that came from the the research on the Guelph Wellington sexual assault domestic violence protocol research. So again, this just speaks to finding ways to respond to the questions that the community had, and we developed this idea of identifying action points and tension points. I'm going to move on to the next slide because I speak further about that. So in terms of thinking about outcomes and outputs, this was, I think, a good example of trying to attend to the needs of many different participants and partners in this work. So we wrote collaboratively a report, which is available online and from the Community Guelph Wellington Sexual Assault Domestic Violence Action Committee. That report was also refereed in the CES for Health repository, which so that is also available there. We created a video that could be used again as sort of a quick way for anyone to get information about what we did and how we did it. We did a number of conference presentations. We wrote an academic publication. I'm going to keep moving. I know I'm running out of time. So it's some of this is thinking about, again, what does it mean to have meaningful outcomes, and what does it mean in terms of disseminating results in appropriate formats, and ensuring that there are community-generated solutions as well. And then the next slide is an example more specifically of the work that I talked about previously with the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses, and the link to their website where you can see some of this, what I would call knowledge mobilization, in a way that was what the community partner was interested in order to make it accessible as an education and advocacy tool. The next slide is the important principle about sharing power. And so again, what others have identified, which I would agree with, is helping to ensure that you have equitable distribution of resources and ensuring that those that you're working with are adequately resourced, that it doesn't become doesn't become a burden to be having the opportunity to work with community partners. It means priority setting, decision making, and again, that happens throughout, but is also really important at the beginning stages. It's things like ensuring that community members own their own data and ensuring that there are shared ownership of the outputs or the products. And the next slide is, so those cover those common principles that I spoke about. The next slide is just identifying what, again, anybody who has worked in these areas on these issues know. There's lots of challenges. So it's very time intensive. It takes a lot of resources. It's hard to have a large number of people maintain their interest and the capacity to continue to be involved, especially at all stages. And it doesn't mean that has to happen, but if they want that to happen, we need to address that. It means being mindful of having and developing methods to address these very complex issues. So we need to think about how to develop methods or use methods in a sensitive and responsive way. It also means being flexible and being able and willing to change. And I think that's really important. And I notice that every time I do community engaged scholarship. It means being mindful of trying to use equitable practices in inequitable conditions. And that's often very challenging. And finally, it means thinking intentionally about knowledge mobilization and thinking about what the impact is going to be and how to measure that impact. And finally, the last slide is really just sort of, again, highlighting what I think are some of the paths to developing and doing critical community engaged scholarship and on issues related to violence against women and their children, and specifically those identities that make this population a more marginalized and vulnerable, group. So the importance of that intersectional framework to understand those connections between identities and how those often work in combination to reinforce and heighten um, experiences of violence. It means minimizing the false line between survivors and researchers. Based on what we know about this issue, um, that it is a very common experience. And so it's really important not to reinforce this kind of us versus them understanding of this issue. Um, but it also means being very mindful and intentional about working in ways to listen and access the incredible community wisdom and wisdom of survivors, especially from marginalized communities. So that is the end of my comments. There are a number of references. I have lots more if people are interested. Thank you for your time and interest, and I think we're going to go to questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that very engaging and informative presentation. Just to let the audience know, a recorded version of this webinar will be shared on the CBRC website. So now it's time for the question and answer period. While you're typing out your questions, I'll let you know about more ways that you can get involved with CBRC. You can continue to engage in our webinars. You can join the Cross Canada Community-Based Research Map by creating your profile on our website. You can access training opportunities such as the Community-Based Research Excellence Tool, or you can be part of our biannual Community College University Exposition. So hopefully you're still thinking about what you want to ask Dr. Morton, because that presentation covered quite a lot of material. So I feel like it kind of sparked some ideas in myself that are still kind of developing. I think when you mentioned femicides in Ontario, that was the first time I've heard of that happening in Ontario. So I'm kind of surprised about that term being used here. Can you talk more about the femicide?
That's interesting. I'm sorry?
Oh, sorry. I was just asking if you could talk more about femicides in Ontario.
Sure. So again, this is work that the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses has been tracking since the 1990s, and it and also is work that my colleague Myrna Dawson has been involved in as well for years, and she's now looking at this issue from a national perspective, as well as in Ontario. But the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses have identified that since 1990, they've been tracking how the mainstream news reports on this issue. And so one of the things that again, the combination of the research on femicide has identified is how important it is to actually refer to it as an issue that is gender-based. And that's why it's important to refer to it not just as a murder, but actually in a gender-specific way, to note that the reason or the root of the murder is about gender-based violence, and so calling it a femicide is a way to bring attention to what is otherwise an invisible issue.
Mm-hmm. Did the research also look at the demographics for who usually falls victim to femicide?
Yeah, so again, that's something that Myrna Dawson and her center has looked at specifically, that is available in that new report, One is Too Many, that talks about the trends and patterns in domestic homicide in Canada 2010 to 2015. So, and again, she looks at some of those specific vulnerable populations. OAIF has also been identifying, one of the things, because our focus is the media's attention, one of the things that's really interesting is we know, given the research on violence against women, that Indigenous women, for instance, are more likely to be victims of femicide. And yet, it's actually hard, often very difficult to find news reports on their murders. So it's a really good example of the way in which mainstream news makes the femicides of Indigenous women invisible. So it often it's difficult. We don't see the amount of media attention to individual Indigenous women who have been killed as a femicide as we do non-Indigenous women. So those are the kinds of things that, again, we're more able to recognize when we actually start to do this kind of research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. It looks like we don't have any other questions from the audience today, but all of your PowerPoint information will be put on the website so that people can access those resources that you talked about. So it looks like we're coming to the end of our hour here. On behalf of Community-Based Research Canada, I would like to thank our wonderful presenter, Mavis, for today's session, and thank you all for joining us. Please take 2 minutes after this webinar to share your feedback, and you'll see that after you log out, the feedback form will automatically show up. And please stay tuned for upcoming webinars, events, and programs from CBRC by going on to communityresearchcanada.ca and by signing up for our mailing list and newsletter. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jenna.